Amen. A couple of questions that are asked in the question and answer box. All of the questions are being copied and pasted into another document, so they're not lost. But I'm trying to, for us to kind of keep on a projected pathway as much as possible. So there is a question, is 1888 a midway to? Yes. All of those dates that take us to 2014 are midways in their own history. The reason I didn't speak about 1888 is it doesn't have the theme of a revolution in 1888 in the same way that the others do. So I wanted us to focus on revolutions. That's why I just chose these two dates, two witnesses: American Civil War, French Revolution. But 1888 is also a midway. The question that came after that, I don't want to answer this question now, but I just want to speak about one thought that I feel is expressed in this question, just as a thought to add to that. Do you think that issues of microaggressions and race-related biases has been addressed within the context of the movement? Speaking from the perspective of a person of colour, we deal with microaggressions on a daily basis at work and in common society. Are the movement's white population being educated on the problems with microaggressions in comments and assumptions that are often made about POC? I'm not sure what POC stands for. People of colour. You have spoken about the external identification of racism and perhaps even sexism. So I'm not sure why they say perhaps even sexism. Sexism. It's not a perhaps even. So I find that it's the person who's anonymous, so I'm not embarrassing anyone. I find that phrasing problematic. I've spoken about the external identification of racism and sexism that definitely worldwide exists in a fashion that kills thousands, tens of thousands of women every year. Let alone the way that they are abused and held back outside of just murder. So I just want to address one point of that. I might erase this now that we're confident with two periods, these two revolutionary periods taking us to 2014. If you can hold that in your mind. When we discussed racism and sexism and equality, what we did was we went back, we could go more complex, we could discuss about the movements that brought us to the time of the end and exist today, from the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, Stonewall. But originally the opening up of the Sunday law subject came from understanding a triple application. (1850) plus 1888 brings us to the Sunday law, and we must combine both of them to understand the sin of the United States at the end of the world. And then, because of the strong right-leaning bent that existed in the movement up until last year, we had to be quite emphatic and firm about with the words that we used. But there has been a major I'm going to say, twisting of that message that has caused some misdirection. I've tried to say this gently many times before, but I think with this question, not to answer the question directly, but I need to make that point, and I want us to have it in our minds as we go back into these studies. We are doing a literal to a symbolic application. 1850, there is a sin in the United States that relates to slavery. It's slavery where the black population is put into slavery and made slaves by the white population. It's a black and white issue, and it exists in the United States. When the United States is judged for that, in the history of the Civil War, on a line, that is the history of the plagues. So 61 to 63, it's the plagues falling because of the sin. Is anywhere else in the world experiencing those plagues? No. The time of trouble, the falling of the plagues, the sin is encapsulated inside America. Can we see that? It's just encased inside America and this issue of slavery. When we come to 1888, what is the issue? In 1888, the issue is, as I said before, it's the Sunday law, but they also want an amendment to the Constitution. So are we going to experience a Sunday law today? No. There's no Sunday law going to come into effect today. We take the theme of that history, and the theme of that history is what? Church and state, Christian nation. The 1850 history, the sin of America, was not this combination of church and state. That wasn't the sin that they were involved in. The sin was oppression, the sin was slavery. Now we're making literal to symbolic applications. 1850, it's encased within the United States. It's an issue between black and white. 1888, what starts to happen? It starts to open up. Now it's not just the United States. It's going to start there, but Ellen White says it's going to spread into other countries, particularly Europe. So 1850 closed. 1888 it starts to open up, becomes an issue of church and state. What happens in our own dispensation? It's worldwide. 1850 closed, 1888 open up, 144,000, it is worldwide. But there is no literal Sunday law in this history. The theme that we take from that is the coming together of church and state. There is no slavery in this issue. What is the theme? What was the issue down here? The core issue. Why didn't they want Mexicans? It's because they considered them interbred. There was those coming from South America, there was indigenous populations. There was European populations they didn't want. There was a mixing of the peoples happening in Mexico that when the United States annexed Texas, they said, we don't even want Mexico. You keep Mexico. We don't want to dilute our race. The issue is nationalism. What the point that I want to make is the application of 1850 today is worldwide. It is not condensed in the United States, and it is much, much broader than an issue between black and white. It is an issue of nationalism, and anyone can be nationalist. Anyone can be nationalist. I've said before, I went to the United States, I taught the message of equality, and what did FFA say? Who are you European socialist, to come and tell us how to behave? I went to Uganda, and what did they tell me? Who are you white colonialist Westerner, to come to our country and tell her how to behave? What's the equal issue in the United States and in Uganda, in America and in Africa? Nationalism. It does not become condensed into the issue of colour. Colour is a part of that, but it is so much broader than we realise. It cannot be limited to just colour. If we speak only of colour, we risk failing the test ourselves. People are often shouting for equality when it comes to colour, and they actually do that from the platform of nationalism. If we don't see the test as clearly as we must, there's the danger that we fail it. Someone says internally we addressed sexism, but I'm not currently seeing the racism issue being tackled as enthusiastically. The reason that much is being said about sexism is because people in the movement, as far as I can see online, are not practicing equality when it comes to sexism to nearly the same degree that they are practicing equality when it comes to colour. We understand, why do these issues come in 3 steps? I've taught this multiple times. Racism, sexism, homophobia. Why are we targeting this one? Because people feel they understand this one while they don't. When people feel they understand this one, there's a sense they've passed the test because they can say Black Lives Matter. Martin Luther King was a sexist. One test comes after the other, it's harder than the other. And sexism is still being openly, overtly practiced in this movement, even by people who say Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to make the point. 1850 is enclosed in the United States. It's an issue between black and white. We must see it today as universal and not condensed into just the subject of colour. It is, but unless we can see our own nationalism, whatever colour we are, if we are black and we are in Africa, we face the same risk of failing that test than if we're white and in America. And that was very much evidenced with how some people took the subject of sexism. Because the minute a white woman tells you, from the West, tells you to stop paying dowry, all of a sudden, it's my culture, it's my country, and I'm proud of where I come from. We do not have a dual citizenship. This issue of racism is not condensed to the United States, and it's not condensed to the subject of colour. Everyone is facing the same test of nationalism, no matter the colour of their skin or the country that they come from. It's an issue for everyone. So that has been, in some ways, misdirected. Yes, it is part of that. The issues in America right now are part of that issue. But we have to look global. The message of equality was for us to turn to those around us and see how we are hurting them. It was for us to look inside and see our own sins, our own nationalism, our own sexism, our own homophobia, and to deal with ourselves. It wasn't for us to fight for our own rights. It was to see how we were hurting the rights of other people. And sexism is so deeply embedded in this movement, people cannot even see it when it's overtly practiced. I don't want to get sidetracked. So, how would Christ have come in 1863 if the conflict was local and not worldwide? We face the same issue today. What does worldwide mean? We have no people in the movement that I'm aware of in Yemen. People will go to heaven who are not properly trained and properly prepared. That's why we have such a heavy burden. That's why we have to live so true to the lines and what God teaches. Because it is our duty to teach them. If Christ had have come back in 1863, there would have been many sins still practiced. Racism would not have been understood as being the depth of sin that it was, even as much as we understand it today. They would have had to have experienced in heaven the growth in understanding that we have had to come to 150 years later. They would have had to have come to the same position that we have on equality for women. There wouldn't have been barely a single person in heaven who truly understood equality in the home. All of that would have had to take place in heaven. Which brings the question, how much do we still have to learn? Do we think we're going to heaven perfect? Or do we continue to be challenged? I think we have a lot to learn in 1,000 years. Perhaps more than we can realise. We'll look forward to that journey if we see it's for our benefit. Back to the revolutions. I don't want to go through all of these revolutions. There's charts done where they're easy to see, nicely drawn. Some very talented people have been helpful to us there and placed out those waymarks for us. I just want to remind us of the application. When we discuss the revolutions, what are we discussing? What are we discussing as we talk about the revolutions? What I'd like to suggest is what was said before. We're discussing the transformation of the United States from a republic to a dictatorship. We're discussing the changing of kingdoms. So when you look at Russia, you can see that it had transitioned from a dictatorship, communist dictatorship. It had transformed into at least the beginning steps of a fragile democracy, and then Vladimir Putin has pulled it back into being a dictatorship. And he did that through a process. He became president in 1999, he was elected in 2000, re-elected in 2004, stood down in 2008 because he couldn't run again, came back in 2012, changed the time span of a term to 6 years instead of 4. I think it was 2018, he's elected again. 2024, he is already set himself up to run a third term by changing the Russian constitution. So there's all of these points along the way where you could mark Russia transforming from a fledgling democracy to a dictatorship. But it's happening progressively in subtle steps that if someone in an information age wants to deny, they can. The exact same thing is happening within the United States. The transformation of a democracy into a dictatorship. And what these lines of revolutions enable us to do is see how that process occurs. it takes us through some specific steps along that journey. So when the United States passes a Sunday law at that waymark, it must already be set up in such a position that it can do that. The United States has strong institutions. It's got 3 branches of government holding each other in check. For the United States to do such an action at the Sunday law, it must be enabled to do that. So if it's going to break that Republican horn, there must have been a process by which those branches of government are structured in such a way that enables it to do that. There must be a restructuring of the executive branch, of the judicial branch, of the legislative branch. Just as Vladimir Putin, through 2004, 2008, 2018, he has restructured Russia to be able to set himself up in the position of power that he has, uniting church and state in the process. What we're seeing is that exact same thing occurring in the United States, and it's just as subtle. All of that must happen before the United States can even consider placing a Sunday law. So the best way to change a government, whether it's from a democratic government to a dictatorial government, or to change a dictatorial government to a democratic government, the usual way that occurs is through revolution or civil war. It's very hard to change the institutions of a country without that degree of activism and effort. And what the lines of the revolutions enable us to do is see that transformation happen in 2 parts, much like other revolutions in history. It takes us from the beginning of a revolution to its end. This is just what we have drawn above, 9/11 to 2019, 2014 as a midway point in that history. That's the history of a revolution as it's given to us in the American Civil War and the French Revolution. But then as we overlaid the German, the Russian, and the second application of the French, we identified that that was just one part of that history. That's the history by which the United States transforms from a democracy to a dictatorship. November 9, 2019, the end point of that revolutionary period. Then we marked a period of quiet until 2020. And the beginning of a counter-revolution. If we were to mark the other histories that we have connected with this, This is the French Revolution, the American Civil War. What takes us from this history is the German Revolution. October 30, 1918. To November 9, 1918. Counter-revolution begins in 1919. January ends in May 1919. Then we took the Russian Revolution. March 8, 1917. Ended November 9, 1917. 1918, counter-revolution. Ended in 1922. Then we took the French Revolution, its whole expansive history. We took it from 1789 to, by their own revolutionary calendar, the 9th day of the 11th month. (1794), counter-revolution, 1795. Ends in 1799. We used those histories to understand our own revolution, 9/11 to 2019, that overthrows the establishment, as many people would call it. And then the following year, there's a counter-revolution begins against this new establishment. So I have discussed, particularly it was in Australia, December of last year, in November and December. November and December of... No, that was last year. And then mostly early December. And then late December, early January in Kenya. There were presentations, a camp meeting done there, where we spoke about what happened between 9/11 and 2019. So I think a photo is being taken of that board work. I'm sorry, the colour doesn't show very well. So as we place where we are on the lines, I just want us to see we're in this time period. And it's covering these revolutions in a way that isn't really just one fixed dispensation. I'll let the photo be taken. It's showing how the United States is transforming. One way of showing this transformation of the United States. What does a dictatorship in the United States look like? How would you expect it to look like? If you think about Vladimir Putin, his people voted him into office. He has a very high popularity rating compared to most world leaders. It's slipped a little, but it's still high. He wins his elections easily. Yes, there is voter fraud, but the fraud is there to enhance the degree by which he wins. Yes, he kills his political opponents. Yes, he silences them. But many Russians still believe in him as their democratically elected leader that they chose and want, that gives some glory back to Russia. So we have to consider what, in a history of information, what a dictatorship looks like. Back in 1888, would the Constitution have been physically changed? Yes, there would have been an amendment to the Constitution. If that had happened early enough, they may have scrapped the whole thing. By the 1880s, it would have been amended. Is it going to be amended today? No. All that they do is say, if you think the Constitution protects minority rights, you're reading it wrong. It'll be about how you read. So these subjects become more difficult to identify. A dictatorship is more difficult to identify today because they keep a degree of deniability. Russia still has its institutions, its parliament, its elections, its constitution, all of that intact. Vladimir Putin has just been able to manipulate that system. These lines mark the beginning of the process in the United States towards this system as beginning in 2001. I want us to think about why it would do that. What happens in 2001? I'm going to read a little from articles here. This is actually a YouTube clip that I've watched him and I've transcribed what he's saying. I'm quoting Gideon Rose. Gideon Rose was the editor of Foreign Affairs. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council from 1994 to 1995 under the Clinton administration. So he's worked particularly for Democrats. Quoting him, 9/11 has changed US foreign policy dramatically in two ways. The first and more obvious way was in bringing the issue of terrorism in general and radical Islamist terrorism in particular to the forefront of US foreign policy agenda. During the 1990s, specialists in terrorist events had noted events like the first World Trade Center bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing. They had started to worry about the rise of terrorism. So they've already in the 1990s started noting the rise of terrorism and were concerned about it. Some in the Middle East were worrying about the rise of Islamic radicalism. What 9/11 did was to combine those trends and make everybody realize that it was the single most important challenge to American foreign policy. The combination of Islamist radicalism and large-scale massive terrorism with mass casualty impact basically made everybody from top to bottom realize that this was what we had to focus on, and this really could hurt us in only the way that a few specialists had thought of before. So that's the first way that 9/11 changed US foreign policy. That's not the one I want to focus on. I want us to focus on the second change. Quoting Gideon Rose, the second thing it did, which was perhaps less obvious, was that it unleashed US power on the world. This sounds a bit weird because the US was obviously powerful beforehand. But during the 1990s, unlike what many people expected, the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer put it in 1991, I believe in foreign affairs turned out to not be a short, temporary period of American dominance, but rather an ongoing and growing one. With the Soviet Union gone, the United States was at the top of the heap. But in the decade of the 1990s, it actually lapped the rest of the world even more so. So it was even stronger in relative power terms in 2000 than it had been in 1990. So what he's saying is that the global order went from bipolar, United States, Soviet Union, to unipolar at the beginning of the 1990s. And then through the 1990s, America continued to become more and more powerful. And yet, because of domestic political constraints, the United States basically didn't use this power in major dramatic ways. So America has condensed power, but it hasn't used power because it has these constraints, these domestic political constraints on its system. The Clinton administration wasn't focused obsessively in projecting American power and wanted to keep it in public limits. And so the American public didn't authorize a lot of things. So the Clinton administration is controlled by the desires of the American public. The Clinton administration does not want to project American power outside what the public in America, outside the limits of what the public in America place upon it. And the American public didn't wish American power used unilaterally internationally. What 9/11 did was basically have Congress and the American public give the executive branch a blank check to get the people who did this and make sure it didn't happen again. That was essentially the keys to the bank account that essentially unleashed all the American power that had been building up and turned it into power projection capabilities. We resulted not just in the Afghanistan campaign, but in the Iraq campaign, in the global war on terror, and massive deployment of American resources in power projection and an activist world role, which would not have been conceivable without the immediate trigger of a threat, that threat being 9/11, terrorism. The interesting thing is that in both these trends we overshot the mark. We went too far. And in retrospect, we can see now that we didn't just get seized with the idea of radical Islamist terrorism, we got obsessed with it. We not only unleashed American power, we squandered American power through its misapplication and misuse. So the irony is that after a decade of dealing with 9/11 and its aftermath, the United States is now coming back to its pre-9/11 condition with a more chastened, less hubristic attitude, a declining power-based domestic situation. We are trying to establish ourselves not just as a global liberal hegemon at large, but also to renew. It has been a sober decade that in the long run will be considered a detour from the path we were on before and that we are getting back to. He said all this in 2011 under the Obama administration. So what Gideon Rose is saying, the United States defeated the Soviet Union. The global order turned into this unipolar system. The United States built up immense power in the 1990s that was not used under the Clinton administration because of domestic constraints. What happened in 2001 was essentially the keys to the bank vault. It enabled the executive branch to absorb, not just to absorb more power, it had that power, but now to project that power internationally with the approval of Congress and with the approval of much of the American public. And what he's saying is that they can see that they overstepped the mark by far. Just one example of that without going into the history of the countries they destroyed, the thousands of lives that they ended, innocent lives, was just in the fact that they did that against international law. That in itself is a prime example in 2003. What he is saying naively is that it was unleashed in 2001. George Bush used that power internationally, but now it's the Obama administration. Now we have a more chastened, less hubristic attitude. Under Obama, we're bringing back that overextension. We're reining ourselves in. Essentially, we're becoming more globalist. We're working within an international system of law and order, not our own definition of law and order. His position on that in 2011, I want to suggest, was incorrect. It was not a small detour on the journey of the United States. George Bush was not that detour. Obama was that detour. Now we're back to that same power projection. We're now in the history of Donald Trump, 9 years after he made that claim. That is a YouTube link. It can later be put on the media broadcast. Not all of Congress and not all of the American public gave that blank check to the George Bush administration. I don't want to go through all of these for time, but I will just reference a couple of articles. There's an article by the New York Times in June of 2006. They talk about the partisanship that started to rise after 9/11. Not in the very immediate days after 9/11, but that event sparked over time this growing partisanship, which is the Civil War. It is the revolution. You have these two partisan sides who no longer can even understand each other's position, fighting for political and social power. There's always been partisanship. It's existed for a long time, but it occurred after 9/11 in a special way. The divisions on the Iraq War escalated this partisanship to a degree not seen before. The US public was divided more by the Iraq War along party lines than they were for the war in Vietnam by far. So if you think the Vietnam War created a partisan divide, it was nothing to what the partisan divide was that occurred due to the Iraq War. In 2014, Mother Jones put out an article, How the Iraq War Launched the Modern Era of Political Misbehaviour. She likes to swear, Mother Jones. There is no debate that the Iraq War was sold to the American public with a collection of claims that ended up being proved false. Iraq was said to have weapons of mass destruction. This was not the case. Advocates for the war insinuated that Saddam Hussein was colluding with Al-Qaeda and was somehow involved in the 9/11 attacks. That too was false. It was disinformation. It was a conspiracy theory. Yet many Americans and some of their leaders still believe this. Many Americans today, people worldwide today, still believe that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. They've never let go of that disinformation. Since 2003, social scientists, psychologists, and pollsters have been busy examining why false beliefs like these are embraced, even in the face of irrefutable evidence. and what impact this sort of disinformation has on American political discourse. The resulting research shows that the Iraq War looks like an early version of a current phenomenon. They're speaking in 2014. The right wing rooting its stances in simple untruths about the world. See climate change. So here's a quick trip through some of the groundbreaking scholarship on how the Iraq War polarized the US public over the acceptance of basic facts. And then it goes into a study, pioneering study, into the effects of Fox News. What partisanship didn't have prior to 9/11 was such a popular channel as Fox News. It existed in 1996, but it particularly boomed in popularity in 2002. Prior to that time span, while you had partisanship, you did not have these channels promoting and sharing disinformation the way you did today. And the way Fox News took the Iraq War and these divisive issues in the United States drove this partisanship. I won't repeat that study for time. The degree of factual polarization over Iraq and the role of partisan media outlets like Fox News in driving it may have marked the dawn of a new normal. Political polarization has increased in the decade since the invasion. So it then goes through various studies that have been done that give evidence of all of this different partisanship and growth of disinformation. Once Americans become polarized over facts, it seems the damage is done. So that article itself is 6 years old, and I think we can see the results of that even today. So these revolutions, they mark the beginning of that civil war at 9/11, come to 2014, and it reaches a point where there's going to be a major swing in that revolution. One side is going to begin to win that war. 2019, you have the establishment of a dictatorship. So it depends on the lines that we use, because they show us different markers along this road of progression. Ipsos shows us the dictator arriving when? 2016. So Ipsos will say Republican horn broken, dictator in the United States in 2016. This study will show you dictator in the United States, breaking of the Republican horn, 2019. Another study will show you 2021. Another study will show you Sunday law. What it's marking is in 4 progressive steps the progression of the United States from a democracy to a dictatorship, and the markers along the way. We need to be able to divide those studies, look at them independently. Is it reasonable to say that the United States had a dictator in 2016? I believe yes. Donald Trump was a dictator the moment he arrived. He's restrained. 2019, is he a dictator? Yes, still restrained. 2021, yes, still restrained. All building up to the releasing of those restraints at the Sunday law. So 2014, one side particularly begins to have victory. 2014 is a turning point. Can people give me 3 things in 2014 that marked a turning point? Three things in 2014. Republicans take the Senate, midterm elections. When they do that, what do they begin to do? there's something specific that they begin to do. Cambridge Analytica. Block Obama's judges. That was the work of who? He called it the most important political decision he's made in his entire career. Mitch McConnell. So in 2014, when the Republicans have so much success in those midterm elections, Mitch McConnell arrives in a position where he can start blocking Obama from filling any judicial appointments in the United States. This led to the judicial branch being completely taken over by a conservative, right-leaning majority by the end of 2019, including the Supreme Court. I hope we're all following the events of the Supreme Court and the rulings they've been making even in the last weeks. You have a 5-4 conservative majority in the Supreme Court, and everyone is just hoping that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is holding on to life. If she goes, it won't even be mid-right wing, it'll be right wing, far right wing. So, Sister Susie says they began to purge the Republican Party. Yes, that's the second one I was looking for. They begin to block Obama from appointing judges to the judiciary branch. One branch of the United States government is going to begin to fall. And then they begin to purge the Republican Party. Every dictatorship must purge their own party of anyone who is not completely loyal to the new dictatorship. It's one of the laws of dictatorship. That was Bannon, Sessions and Miller. Steve Bannon, Jeff Sessions, Stephen Miller. They met in 2012 at the Breitbart Embassy and planned how they would turn America around. The first step they decided to take was to purge the Republican Party of any moderates. Anyone who was a moderate Republican needed to be removed. They needed only far-right loyalists. They began in 2014 when they united with Fox News and they removed the first head they needed to put on a spike of the Republican Party. Third event of 2014, looking for a Supreme Court decision. Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4, 5 men, 3 women and a man against, but the 5 took it, allowing held for profit corporations to be exempt from a regulation its owners religiously objected to. So this has happened just in the last few weeks. This ruling has been extended even farther under the Trump administration, but it ties back to a 2014 decision. And it was about whether or not someone owned a company, a for-profit corporation, whether or not they would be forced to, in their employees' health insurance, be forced to cover birth control if they were, in their religious beliefs, the owners were opposed to it. And the Supreme Court judged they would not be required. Quoting the go back and see how Ruth Bader Ginsburg responded to that ruling. She called it a fearful precedent, what would come from that. Americans united for separation of church and state. They say Such approaches, while important, are just a start. The ruling in this Supreme Court case goes beyond the question of access to birth control. It opens a door that could lead to a dangerous reinterpretation of the meaning of religious freedom. Under this new definition, that noble principle, which for a long time had projected the rights of Americans, becomes a thing to be used to impose theology on the unwilling. This cannot stand. Americans must take the necessary steps to prevent the further spread of this corrosive and reckless definition of religious freedom. And we can see that that decision has had implications. It has continued to erode religious freedom, even just showing in the court case, Supreme Court case a few weeks ago that expanded this decision. Again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and I think Sotomayor both stood against that as well. So there's the Supreme Court decision that has had far-reaching consequences. There is the beginning of the purge of the Republican Party in preparation for this dictatorship, and there is the blocking of Obama from appointing judges, the taking over of the judiciary. So 2014 becomes a major turning point. 2019. So I'll ask this question before we close. What did you expect to see November 9? Because all of the studies of the revolutions is what locked in November 9 as a day. So what do people expect to see on November 9? What were many people expecting to see on the day? We have many people online and many are shy. Someone says a dictator. Not based on this study. Going back to your thoughts last year, if some of you thought that way. Putin taking more spheres of influence. Impeachment. Impeachment. A turning point towards more violent persecutions of of minorities. Sister David and Kathy Brown said nothing. It distracted me. Good for you. You understood the cross. Impeachment. The final overthrow of the Republican Party. Brother Vadim asked, do you speak of the day or the year? I'm speaking of the day. Nothing on the very day, an overturning. A disappointment. FFA laughed because there was no impeachment. A media restraint. That's actually quite a broad spectrum of answers. So I'll only leave us with one question, and then we'll have another short break. I'll pray to close. Why would we expect impeachment on November 9? Because impeachment in 1868 did not happen on November 9. It took us to the year, not a date in the year. So I think we should be clear that we would never have did not expect impeachment to relate to November 9 as a day. The other questions we will come back to just after a break. If you would kneel with me. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Lord, our hearts ache as we know many of our brothers and sisters are battling through this time. Many, Lord, are considering whether or not this path is worth it. Many see beauty in the lines, but too much that troubles them. Many people are hurting, Lord. I pray that you will help us to anchor them in your truth. Lord, may they see beauty in these things. May they see that in everything you demand of us, Everything that you teach us is for our healing and restoration. How little do we still understand your character? How do we truly understand the depths of sin? It seems, Lord, that we were blind back in the 1800s. People were blind to the depths of sin as it relates to equality, not just on racism, but on how deep that runs within us when it turns into nationalism, when it stems from nationalism, when headship was not a thing to be questioned. Lord, we see that back then people could not realize the depths of sin. We wonder what we can see clearly today. I pray, Lord, that we'll trust to use your eyes to see truth and error as it is. May we not trust our own feelings, our own inclinations, what we want to do, our own desires. May we trust what you tell us. I pray, Lord, that you'll help us through this difficult part in our journey. Reinforce to us the beauty of our lions. May each one of us see how you have led us in the past. May we trust how you led us. May we not be given cause to doubt our past experience. May we see that you did not lead us into the wilderness to destroy us in the wilderness. Many may not make it through it, Lord. But we still desire everyone. We love every soul. So I pray for them. Please, Lord, do not let them go easily. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.